I'd like to introduce now Paul, is that right? Paul's from Scotch in Melbourne, and he's going to have a look at the pros and cons of digitising a school archive and talk about the processes that he's used and whether or not we should digitise and how we go about it.
There are many great archival minds sharing their knowledge at this conference. Mine is not one of them. I'm speaking purely about my personal experience with digitising archives and sharing it so that you can be aware of my experiences, what I've found has worked or what hasn't worked. You may agree with some of those things or disagree with some of those things. For those of you starting out, it will be all new to you and hopefully it will be helpful. Should I digitise things in my archive and museum? I include museum because very few of us purely have records. We usually have trophies, photo albums, all kinds of objects as part of our collections. So they have to be considered in digitisation as well. So the answer to that question is yes. Should I digitise everything in my archive and museum? The answer to that is no, or probably not. And that's for a few different reasons. There are many things that are not really worth digitising unless you have a bottomless pit of money and endless server space or cloud space to store those things. Quite often people above us will say, I want you to digitise everything, but they do not provide the money, the resources, the space to do it. And so you have to be prepared to stand up to those people and say no, or no, it's not possible, or explain why it's not possible or why it's not practical. Now, if you do have endless space and resources, then by all means do it. But a lot of things are needlessly digitised. So because you probably don't have a bottomless pit of money or resources, you need to consider what to prioritise when you digitise things. And to my mind, the single greatest things we as school archivists must digitise to in some way back up the originals are the student records. So original registers, enrolment cards, cards like that give details of names, dates of birth, dates of starting and leaving at the school, and what they did while they were at the school. You lose those things and you lose the most important data about those who have attended the school. The same also applies to staff records, and if your schools are anything like most schools I know, the staff records are generally very patchy and pretty terrible. My inspiration for getting involved in large-scale digitisation was when I became the acting archivist at the end of 2011. I had archives stored in 2 old houses from the 1920s that had no fire protection, possums and rats running through the ceiling. I was absolutely terrified that they'd chew through wires and burn the whole lot down. So I began to digitise photographs. I have fireproof safes and they contain the main student records, but photographs are quite often unique and particularly important records that once lost, particularly unique ones, you can never recover. So photographs became the focus of my digitisation, and they still are. Remember though that digitisation is not the same as the original. It will never replace the original, and the one exception is things like films, which I have been digitising because they decay. Audio tapes and things like that decay, and quite often the digital copy of those things will actually prove to be better and more important than the original. Before you embark on digitising multitudes of things, you need to consider what the output will be, what file format you'll get and how it will be delivered. And for example, PDFs will often be used because they are much more compact, take up less server space, and are considered for that reason. But if you want to modify those things in Photoshop or things like that, then they are not a particularly friendly file format. When I began digitising, I had things digitised in both JPEGs and TIFFs. JPEGs so they were more email friendly, and then TIFFs so they were better for reproduction. I've since then been stripping out all the JPEGs because I never use them. They just took up needless space and with needless duplication. TIFFs are uncompressed files and are very friendly when it comes to modifying them as digital files. So although they take up a bit more space, they're much more practical and a much better quality file, particularly for reproduction purposes. This was a question I addressed when I started out with my digitisation. I had a real urgency to get some form of backup for the photographs before the possums set fire to the two houses. And what I thought would be the best way to do that would be to buy a scanner. The archives had an A4 size scanner, but a lot of our photographs, particularly group or class photographs, are on mounted cards with names, and they need an A3 size scanner. So I investigated that. The cost was going to be about $7,000, and it still is in fact. And I thought that I would get my volunteers to do the scanning. I have typically 20 volunteers, and usually about 13 of them are reasonably active and come in each week. Some for 2 days a week, some for 1 day a week, most for half a day a week. And when I realised I had tens of thousands of photographs to be digitised as quickly as possible before the possums destroyed them, and if not the possums, the rats, I realised that it would take forever to rely on the volunteers to do this process. The volunteers mostly in their 60s, 70s, 80s and 90s, some better at using digital things than others, but they would all take training. So I was quite fortunate that our file folder suppliers said that they did digitisation. And so I then got them to start the digitisation process. There are pros and cons of using both. So in-house pros, you've got complete control of the process and you are naming the files correctly. You're saving money by not outsourcing it, of course. And there's a big benefit in the fact that records don't go off site, so there's not the risk of loss because the truck carrying them crashes or because they are mishandled at the other end. In-house cons, as I mentioned before, it takes longer because you're doing it yourself or volunteers are doing it or other people in the school are doing it for you. You probably won't have the technical expertise of those outside. And scanners, as I mentioned, ideally you need at the very least to get an A3 size scanner, but then you can't do plans, maps and other bigger format things like that. Outsourcing has its own pros and cons. So larger volumes, like I said, I wanted to get things digitised quickly as fast as I possibly could. And so it made sense to me to send out thousands of things at a time to get them digitised. Those professional commercial scanners, in some cases, their equipment is worth 6 figures. The quality is going to be immeasurably better than what you're likely to buy for your archives office. And for example, there are specialised book turning machines that actually blow the pages over. So if you have something important that's bound that you don't want to cut up to put through a document feeder, they can be done that way. The cons are many. I've used 4 different scanning companies. I've used most of them or some of them multiple times, and none of them have delivered on time. They have all been months overtime in doing their delivery. They have all had problems with naming files, not following the file name conventions I've given them, and it's been a real source of frustration. The best you can do in this case is to ask around, see what other people's experiences have been. If you're new as a school archivist and you don't know any others, get online, check forums, put out the word through the ASA, Find people who have had the experience and can share their experiences with you. Speak to the people who are going to do the work and make sure you determine what file formats are going to be produced, what level of resolution will be used. They're all important things. There's no point embarking on a big project if what's done won't suit your needs. And the most critical thing is to make sure you know the people who will be doing the work, managing the work, know their contact details, keep in contact with them. One of the big cons of outsourcing is that these companies keep on taking over one another, and so the personnel keeps changing, and you might have built up a relationship with someone that you then lose because they're cut in that process. This was a major project, student cards, which were digitised before the Royal Commission in case Scotch was called before it, which fortunately it wasn't. 29,487 cards were digitised. Most of them were double-sided. They were confidential student cards from 1917 to 2001, increasingly more and more detailed as time went on, handwritten, detailed teachers' comments, confidential comments made on the basis that students would never be allowed to see them either as students or after leaving the school. One thing I agreed to but should not have done was agreed to them being barcoded, and the barcodes were then put next to hyperlinks. Now the problem is, due to a lack of quality control, their idea of quality control is checking 1 in 10 records. As soon as I got the records back and randomly checked for a few people, there was no barcode beside names that I was looking up. There are some where they've put them beside the wrong names, and because it's only identified as a barcode, there's no way of searching for the missing record. I had wanted them all to be named with the students' names. They could actually be searched. Now, you have to think, particularly before embarking on a project this big, about what you're going to do with the information you're getting that you're digitising. And so one thing I did do, beginning from about 1962, photographs of boys starting at the school were put onto the cards in the top right-hand corner. So what I did was I had an automated system set up so that, as well as scanning the whole card, they would automatically scan that top corner so that if there was a photograph there, it would be captured, and it would be captured at higher resolution. So although all these were done in PDF, the main cards were done at 300 dpi, the photographs were done at 600 dpi, so that I could have a good image, and when I'm writing obituaries about a boy for the school magazine, such as this boy here who died in 2016, I have that photograph there ready to use. I was asked last year to get all of our portrait paintings photographed for insurance purposes and to learn what it would cost to get them repainted in the case of disaster. And I know, for example, that another Melbourne school, Melbourne Grammar School, lost all of its portrait paintings in a fire in 1910. So it's a very real possibility. So we got in an extremely good photographer who actually happened to go to Melbourne Grammar to take our portrait paintings. This is a painting of a vice principal done in 1956. What I got him to do was to capture the entire painting, then the portrait, the specific portrait, so that if we want to reproduce that, we've got that ready to go. He said the hands are a very important part of any painting, apparently notoriously difficult to capture, so he captured that. I asked him to capture any artist's name or any other details that might be revealed by the unframed paintings. We had professional framers come in to deframe and then reframe the paintings, and that's probably impossible to read there, but that's Dargie's name painted at bottom right, Sir William Dargie. So there are about 30 of those that were done. "40 years ago, if you had a badly damaged photograph, you had two choices. You could either re-photograph it and then try to repair that image, or you could try to do something with the original image, but you could not do as good a job as you can do now with the availability of digitising and then modifying that digital file. You can see on the left there a picture of the Scotch crew of 1900, and you can see it's got damage right across it. Some of the faces, particularly at top left and second right, were quite badly affected by the damage. I've got a lady who does very good digital restoration work on photographs, and I got her to work on this photograph. One of the benefits was that 3 of the boys were in the crew the year before, and that photograph was quite undamaged, so we could compare faces and help to get the features right. Objects. Consider getting very good, high-quality photographs taken of your objects for a multitude of reasons. They can involve publicising the archives online, putting them in an online catalogue, providing a backup of sorts in case they are destroyed. By all means, use your phone and snap away if that's the best option you've got, but if you can afford it, get somebody in to take really good photographs with specialised lenses to get the finer details captured. I'll now show some things from the museum I set up last year. On the left is an exercise book from 1858, which is from my own personal collection, but which I store at Scotch because there is no safer place to store it than there. And on the right is a composition book from 1890 with Year 12 boys' work in Latin, Ancient Greek and in English. Now, I could have displayed those books in the museum. I could have had them open to show what was in them, but I could have only shown one double-page spread from each book. And by putting them out there, they would be exposed to natural light, which is the enemy of archives. So what I did instead was I had this panel done where I could show multiple images from both books by having them photographed and included in that panel. When I finally got fire-protected, climate-controlled facilities for the first time with no possums or rats to destroy them, and I was getting a museum for the first time, I wanted to display some of the very nice things in the school archives. One of the things I'd long wanted to display was the oldest known blazer we have from 1907, which is there on the right. And I'd planned to put them on mannequins and probably put those mannequins in a glass display case. But then I realised there's still natural light, and those dark cardinal blazes would soon be faded by that natural light. And just even putting things over a mannequin, although it provided a fair bit of support, things such as blazers and jumpers will still drag because of the weight in them. So they could still be getting damaged by that alone. And so I quickly realised that the answer was instead to leave those blazers in their boxes between tissue paper out the back, safe, and instead have these photographed in very high quality by the same photographer. So what this meant is those are part of a panel of 4. In between there are explanatory notes about them. Those blazers are reproduced at about half size, which still makes them quite large. They can still be seen quite clearly. If those panels fade, they can be reproduced in 5 or 10 years' time. But meanwhile, the blazers are protected. It also means it's possible to display them in much, much less space than would have been possible had the originals been displayed. They are a very, very important part of the collection, and it was very good to be able to confidently and safely display them in that way. This is another example of doing the same sort of thing. This panel is probably about 900 by 600 mils, maybe less. And because all these things have been photographed and then shrunk, it means you can include a lot of things in a very small space. My museum is the old driveway between the two old houses filled in. So it's a very small area to display 171 years of Scotch's history. And I had to be very, very clever, I hope, in the way I used that very small space to try and convey that history. So this shows school caps, blazer pockets, badges, football jumpers, rowing t-shirts, school spray jackets, and it miniaturises them, so to have displayed those originals would have taken up multitudes more space than this panel does. But this panel is big enough to show those things clearly enough while those items are safely protected in storage. Plus there's room for explanatory notes. If you have things that need a lot of explanation and you're displaying the objects, quite often it means a whole lot of little cards dotted around, which is not quite as neat. This is a very good example of that. So the cap badges and the caps were used in the senior school until 1968 when they became optional and the boys opted to never wear them again, are a thing of fascination for people who never knew them. They were symbols of rank, privilege, prestige, boys who were in first sports teams, boys who were prefects, boys who were probationers, boys who were doing sub-intermediate, intermediate, leaving honours, matriculation, the works, house captains, etc., etc. So what I did here was, rather than displaying every single badge, I had these, again, these badges were photographed in very high quality. They are reproduced at about 4 times the size of the original badges, so they're much easier to see. I've then got panels beside each one that explains what they are. And then in the display itself, I have displayed random badges so people can see the real thing that are explained there in any case. One other benefit of digitisation is you can have one thing in many places simultaneously, and sometimes they are things you may not have yourself. So, for example, the Fairbairn Cup there on the left is the trophy for rowing in the Associated Public Schools of Victoria. It's the most sought after cup. The race dates back to 1868 and started when Scotch College challenged Melbourne Grammar School. The Fairbairn Cup was given in 1911 and Scotch has won at the most of all of the schools, not just because it began at the start, but because it's been particularly successful. And it's lost 3 times since 2004. So Scotch has that cup more often than not, but not always. So for those times we don't have it, we've got a photograph to remind the boys they need to get it back the following year. The cup beside it is the Sumner Cup, and that was given for competition to be retained by the school which first won it 3 times, which Scotch did in 1879. So Scotch has kept that cup ever since. Now that is displayed in a rowing display I set up in the boat shed, but it means that for people who come to the museum, they can see a photograph of it there and it's explained there as well, as too is the Fairbairn Cup, which is never displayed in the museum but is photographed and explained. Now, this was a fascinating thing. When I was unpacking the 2 houses worth of archives in late 2020, when we were finally allowed back during a break between COVID lockdowns, 13 volunteers had been involved in packing up the 2 houses. I expected they would be available to unpack them, but they were not allowed on site. I was not allowed on site for a long time either. So in the end, I and my offsider were unpacking it over 3 months, which was a very arduous exercise. But in so doing, I saw things I'd never seen before, despite being involved with the archive since 1995, beginning as a volunteer. And one of those things was a scrapbook that had belonged to an old boy, Andrew Robert Robertson, who became a Member of Parliament for Victoria and started this scrapbook in about the 1920s or so. But he'd been a member of the Scotch crew of 1885, and he at some stage when he started this scrapbook had pasted in the bow flag from that boat into the scrapbook. And I was looking through the scrapbook wondering why we really had it and whether we really needed it, whether it was relevant enough to keep. And then I saw that. The original is there on the right. I sought advice from the Grimwade Centre about getting it removed from the book because it was pasted in. It was done on silk and it was nastily stained with some brown staining and splotches of ink. Their advice was it couldn't be safely removed, and because it was silk, they really couldn't do much with it and it was best left there. But then they said they could do a 3D replica of it, and that amazed me. I didn't know it was possible to do that. And so we embarked on a long COVID-interrupted journey of trying to reproduce that. One thing I did want to do in reproducing it was to get the worst of the ugly staining removed from it, but not to make it look brand new either. They had real difficulty in dealing with it because of the blotchy colours. It took many goes. They nearly gave up, but I said, we've come this far, let's keep going. And eventually we got something that I can display in the museum, and it doesn't matter if it fades because the minimum print run had about 30 of them. So there's probably 300 years worth or more of those to change over in the museum. The last slide I've got shows a lovely plan of Scotch's Memorial Hall, which was designed in 1919 and opened on Anzac Day 1922, 100 years ago. I was asked whether the school had the plans of the original buildings on the current site. I said no, but I said I could probably track them down. I tracked down the architect's great-nephew, who was also an architect, and they were all stored in tubes under his house. I was allowed to borrow them, to scan them, and then gave them back. I made printouts of those scans as well, so there was a hard copy version of them. They were stored on the school server, which is where we store all of our things. I hadn't accessed them for several months and tried to open one of them, and the file was corrupted. All of the files were corrupted and couldn't be opened. And the school's backups at that stage would go back about 2 months. So at some stage, a virus had gotten onto somebody's computer which corrupted those files, and then those corrupted files were being backed up. And this is the best single example of why digital records or digitised things are never as good as the originals. Paper will last for hundreds of years in many cases. Digital files can be deleted with the press of a button. They can be hacked. They can be corrupted. There's a whole lot of things that can so easily happen to them by external or internal forces. Fortunately, I had the CDs to which these images had been burnt, because this was about 8 years ago. We still use these things called compact discs. They were stored in the fire safe, they were re-uploaded, and they're back on the server. But that brings me to the last point about cloud storage and server storage, on-site storage. People think that the cloud, or many people think the cloud is this impenetrable safe to put things in where they can never be touched. We know from a very famous celebrity's photographs being hacked that that is not the case. You don't know who's behind the company that owns a part of the cloud you're using. If you've got things stored on your own server, you've got more control over that. And Scotch will not use the cloud for anything at all at this stage, and certainly nothing confidential such as student records. So they are all stored on internal servers and are backed up twice a day. And I think the backups now go back quite a lot longer than 2 months as well. So that is a very, very quick run through my experience of digitisation, and I certainly welcome your questions after Kate has spoken. Thank you.
Okay, have we got any questions? We've been given a lot to think about and a lot to put in process, and probably for some of us it's a little daunting. Yep.
Hi, I'm Louise. I'm really interested in, so from outside the school archives community, things look really complex. Like it's quite interesting to get a sense of the responsibility you shoulder. So I'm a parent of a 12-year-old in an independent school, and I know their record keeping consists of a shed. And I teach students at Charles Sturt, and I teach lots of teacher librarians who are landed with the job of looking after the archives, and they enrol in the archives subjects. And it's really interesting because this is a foreign landscape to some of them, quite deeply foreign. So one of my questions to you is, some of the detail that Kate and Paul have presented is what's your value proposition? Like your community, for those of us from the outside, it's quite hard to understand the place of records and archives. You look so handsomely resourced. So, and it's like, you know, like I'm sure council archivists amongst us would be going, oh my God, they can like make a display and have a museum.
Yeah.
It seems like wealthy from the outside. And I'm sure that's a kind of cultural phenomenon that you have to manage a lot, is you're kind of in the haves, where there's other parts of the archive community who are in the have-nots. So I'm just wondering if I can ask that rather awkward question, you know, because I'm sure the conversation looks different inside your community than outside it.
Yeah, I'm happy to start with that. Thanks, Louise. And it's interesting you say I had a little bit of experience in teaching the archival management course in Adelaide myself, so I understand that side of it. But I think what we do as archivists is we're essentially also selling the school. So we're trying to historicise and make the school look particularly valued and based in heritage. But also for that reason, if we're lucky enough to have a support from executive, we are hopefully supported to do some of the programming. But having said that, I have a pretty small budget, but I'm just starting to lay the foundation of what I need to do, and then I'm going to be able to just use some documentation to leverage, we need this amount of money, or we need this amount of money to do this and that. But it's a bit of smoke and mirrors, I think. I think Paul's examples of his exhibition spaces are really fantastic. Mine are really not, they haven't really been extended since I've been in the role, because I've been building the role. I haven't really had time to do anything with the exhibition spaces except that new piece that I showed, which was a bit of a quick fix actually. So at the same time, it meant that we could look at the digitisation process and what needs to be done for digitisation. But I'm not sure if that's answering that properly. Do you want to add, Paul? Or else?
Just to give an example, my budget's also fairly small too. There are schools like ours that I have seen. I visited a lot of schools and seen what they've got. There was one school where its entire archives were things stored on the floor in the corner of one room. There's another one where the student records and what comprises or stands for the entire archives is stored in one room about 8 feet by 8 feet. So they do all vary in terms of resourcing that we get. The smoke and mirrors comment's very apt. We do need to make things look a lot better than perhaps they are, but a very big part of it is the past students of the school are attracted to it. There's a lot of researchers that come to it. A lot of it's not as neat and as nice as we like, but it's a gradual process. In the case of my facilities, I spoke about the 2 old houses. I still have the 2 houses, but they're being stuck together. I've got a new compactus area built on the back. A lot of fundraising was done from the old boys to make that possible.
And I'll very briefly say, from the records point of view, the value proposition has to be sold to the school. Protective record keeping is the way to sell it to the school, and risk management. And my school, that has caused them, although we're a low risk school, we have no real reason to do this. It's a matter of planning and future-proofing. It's just the way they see the business environment for non-government schools. So it's a business decision. You sell it as such, and they will be investing more time and more resources into this next year. So I was able to successfully put that to them, and that is a major part of the role of the school archivist with what Paul and Kate do, and with the focus of my work that I've delivered today. You must sell it to your school.
And you're currently advocating within the school for the archive as well. You're the gatekeeper, the custodian, the advocate, you're everything. Otherwise, it really will just be just a dusty shed. And in my case, our storage is at literally capacity with, potentially 50, 100 years more of records being kept over time. I really have nowhere to put anything. So I'm currently sort of lobbying for more storage, both digital and, virtual.
So it looks good, Louise, but there's a lot of work behind it.
But it's
And we present it well, and every school archivist would know what we mean.
One more question, and that's we're going to have to call it quits.
I just have a quick question, or it's actually a statement in response to that question as well. One of our jobs is actually to document the history of education in Australia, and I really like the fact that Paul had that the student work, and I think that's one of our jobs, and how children play and played over the years, and I think that's something that is probably not valued as much, but I think in terms of actually, and it's something we're looking at my school, is actually looking at the students' work over time, over, in your case, 150 years. I mean, it is a really valuable asset to education, I do believe.
It's good, and at the moment it's excellent to be able to do things like we made a COVID-19 digital time capsule, which captures that, exactly what you say, but in the moment of COVID-19 to be able to look back on it.
Okay, well, I'd like you to thank our three speakers. Thank you to Rose, Kate and Paul. Pass them along.